What a weird motherboard. The AsRock Taichi B550 has launched. It is upon us, as are the new XT series chips. And this is a weird one, because the B550 Taichi I like a little better than the X570 Taichi. The X570 is the older chipset, it's the launch chipset for the Ryzen 3000 series CPUs, which is a year old. So here we are with B550 launching a full year later. It's a little late to the party, isn't it? Let's take a look. Alright, first up, a rundown. What is the difference between X570 and B550 with the AM4 socket? If you're considering building your own machine based around a Ryzen 3000 processor, AM4 is the socket that you're going to be dealing with, at least for the desktop CPUs. I'm talking about 3000 series Threadripper, that's a whole other thing. Although I do love my Threadripper for high-end, high-performance machines. But you can get up to 16 cores in AM4. There's X370 and B350 and B450 and X470 and X570 and now B550. The X570 CPUs launched with the 3000 series Ryzen. 3000 series Ryzen brought us PCI Express 4, which is a very fast peripheral interface. PCI Express 4 NVMEs debuted with the launch of Ryzen 3000 a year ago. They're not as mainstream as I would have expected them to be, but we are seeing really high performance NVMe 5, 6, 7 gigabytes per second, even high performance PCI Express 4 NVMEs from Samsung at this point. Although a little fleeting availability unless you've got very deep pockets, but overall pretty exciting. We've got PCI Express 4 graphics cards, the 5700 XT and the other Navi based GPUs from AMD, and so there are some PCI Express 4 peripherals in the market. When X570 first launched, some people tried to get their PCI Express 4 peripherals, like their PCI Express 4 NVMe, working on B450. Now, it's a little bit mixed results because those boards weren't exactly designed for it. They weren't qualified for PCI Express 4. So one board would work, another board wouldn't work. It turned into kind of a mess. So enter B550 a year later. It gives you PCI Express 4 for the NVMe and some PCI Express 4 X16 connectivity for your GPU, but the chipset itself is PCI Express 3. As a result of that, the board runs cooler, it doesn't require a chipset fan. A lot of people really complained about the chipset fan. Personally, I think it was overblown. A lot of people don't want a tiny, whiny fan on X570. That was kind of exacerbated because there was a couple of motherboard models that had unfortunate placement of that chipset fan directly on the motherboard. It's like directly under the GPU, so if you bought the wrong GPU and the wrong motherboard, the GPU would just dump all of its heat onto the chipset, and then that little fan would have to whine in order to keep the chipset cool because it is PCI Express 4, and so it ran hot and there were a lot of complaints. It's basically overblown. If you get a quality X570 motherboard, the chipset fan's not going to bother you. And there was one model where they turned the entire motherboard into a heatsink. That one was from another vendor, and that was an option. AsRock also had a pure water cooling version that would be fine if you're that worried about your chipset fan. But if you're not going to have a lot of PCI Express 4 peripherals, because the X570 is a PCI Express 4 chipset, it's got a lot of PCI Express 4 lanes coming off of the chipset. So if you want to run 3 PCI Express 4 NVMe, you can do that with X570. B550 is still pretty high end. You get the PCI Express 4 NVMe directly to the CPU. That's going to work and be fine. Then you get one PCI Express 3.0 by 4 NVMe through the chipset. And the other PCI Express lanes are PCI Express 2.0. So it's a mix of PCI Express 2.0 and 3.0 through the chipset. Now, for sound cards, most capture cards, even our really high-end Magewell capture cards, those are still PCI Express 2.0. So it's not really a big deal that those are just PCI Express. It's a mix of PCI Express 2 and 3 lanes from that B550 chipset. So the USB layout, I mentioned, is like B550 is better than the Taichi X570. Well, the X570 is PCI Express 4, but the B550 seems to have more USB ports. If you look at the onboard headers for the USB 3.2 Gen 2 10 gigabit and USB 3 5 gigabit, we've got an extra header. Also got some extra connectivity at the back of the motherboard. We've even got upgraded VRM. It's 14 phases. It's 12 phases for the CPU plus 2 phases for the system on chip and graphics and that kind of thing for the eventual APUs that are coming, the 4000 series. The VRM on this motherboard is extreme overkill. If you're going to run a 16-core chip and you don't want a chipset fan, this is probably the motherboard for you, the 3950X, because in our testing, it was a struggle to get the VRM, even in this open air configuration, to go much past 60 degrees C. It's an incredible solution. I mean, it's a Vishay implementation, and we got Nichicon 12K caps. The full spec rundown is on screen. Yeah, this is just, I don't know. This is overkill. This is completely nuts. Of course, this is a more expensive board. If you look at the price of this B550 motherboard versus the X570, I'm looking and I'm not really seeing much of a price difference. This is a really high-end B550 motherboard. The audio implementation is an ALC 1220. It's a really great implementation, very low signal to noise ratio. The microphone input is pretty good. Sometimes I plug in a headset and I just do a test recording just to see how it goes, and it's usually the Ode to Spot poem. Felis catus is your taxonomic nomenclature, an endothermic quadruped, carnivorous by nature, just to see how that sounds, and it sounds pretty good. So if you're just using a headset, you'll be fine with this audio implementation. It's totally okay. So yeah, B550. What about Linux testing? Well, I'm happy to report Linux testing was basically okay out of the box. Everything worked as you would expect it to. It's got an Intel 2.5 gig NIC. You will need a newer kernel to support the Intel 2.5 gig NIC. That's the only sort of catch or gotcha. I would have loved to have seen a 1 gig NIC, just in case, but it's also got the Intel Wi-Fi 6, which is pretty well supported on most Linux distros at this point. So you can always use the Wi-Fi connection to get on the internet to update your kernel or update your distro to be sure that you've got the Intel 2.5 gig driver, but probably not going to be an issue if you've got a relatively recent distro. There was one wrinkle though, and that's with Iommu. So because the B550 chipset is not as complex, I guess, as the X570, whereas the X570 was like dreamland for Iommu and peripheral separation, pretty much everything that goes through the chipset is in Iommu Group 0. Yeah, it's unfortunate. So I was seeing the NIC, the Wi-Fi, and a whole bunch of other peripherals that are hanging off of that B550 chipset in Iommu Group 0. So this is what we're working with on the Taichi B550 Iommu. Everything on the chipset is in one group. Wah wah. But at least we have separation of our GPUs. So this is our Pcie configuration. You can kind of see here where we got, 4 NVMe on the liquid HHHL, PCI Express by 1 video capture device, and then 2 video cards in the X8 slot. Now this is a little bit of a departure from B450, but this motherboard will let you run in a by 8x8 configuration. So you can run multiple graphics cards. I did that and I was able to get the graphics cards into their own separate Iommu groups because those lanes were directly to the chipset. So one of our NVMe, our PCI Express 4 NVMe, is in its own group, and then each of the X16 slots, which become by 8x8, are directly into the CPU and in their own Iommu group. Everything else, however, is not in its own Iommu group, including the PCIe slot that's hanging on the very end of the motherboard, because that PCIe slot, the very bottom X16 slot, is actually X4 electrical, and it goes through the chipset. So I don't think I'm going to recommend this motherboard for virtualization, with the caveat that if you use the ACS patch, you may have some stability issues, but you could theoretically run it. The question is going to be, how does this break down when we see the 4th gen APUs? Because there's probably only going to be PCI Express by 8, and you've got the iGPU plus an add-in graphics card. That might be a better situation for a relatively low-end VFIO Iommu system, but all things being equal, especially with the X570 Taichi versus the B550 Taichi, you're going to go with the X570 Taichi if you're building an Iommu, para-virtualized GPU rig, because of the Iommu separation is just much better on the X570 platform so far in my testing. There was one other really odd thing that I'll point out. So the XT chips have launched, and there are performance anomalies. So initially I was doing testing with the 3900X and the 3900 XT on this motherboard, and the 3900X was performing worse with the newer BIOS on a B550 than it was on the Taichi X570. Good news though, a new third one BIOS launched just before this video, just before I was putting this video together, and it seems like those performance anomalies have been resolved, but the power utilization is a little weird. So it seems like if you undervolt an XT by, I don't know, 0.05 volts, something like that, or 0.1 volts, which the AsRock BIOS has the option to do that, then it seems to boost higher for longer. It performs more like the old 1.0.0.4 Agiza, which is what I did almost all of my testing on for the XT CPU launch. So I think the XT CPUs are getting more power than they should and not clocking as high. Still a little bit, but it's much improved with the very latest BIOS. So that's the only sort of odd thing, and I'm sure that there'll be a link to the forum thread about this motherboard at level 1, and that you can get up to the minute information if you're watching this video in the future. And it's like, oh yeah, no, that's I don't think that that's going to be a thing probably by the time I actually get the video out, just because those BIOS updates are coming hot and fast, especially for the XT CPUs. If you've got a 2nd gen or a 3rd gen CPU that you're just going to plop in this thing, no problem. Of course, the advantage for the future is B550 is going to support those 4th gen Ryzen CPUs, which is going to be nice later in 2020. And just a quick mention for our XT testing, I was using the Pcie Fuma 2, which is a really good tower cooler. It's inexpensive, but it works well, especially for the XT CPUs that do not come with a boxed cooler. So might be something you want to take a look at. Another feature of the XT CPUs is 3800 megahertz Infinity Fabric. That is not official. 3600 is still, sort of what AMD is saying, but all 3 of my press sample XT CPUs would run at 3800 megahertz, which is the 1900 megahertz Infinity Fabric, and it is rare that I would have gotten a 3000 series Ryzen CPU that was stable with the 1900 megahertz Infinity Fabric corresponding to 3800 megahertz memory. This motherboard supported 3800 megahertz memory, no problem at all. Sometimes on some of the less expensive motherboards that's not a thing, but again, B550 runs the range. There will be inexpensive B550 motherboards that cannot do memory faster than 3600, but this is a premium B550 motherboard. I mean, the VRM shows that, and the audio implementation shows that, and so of course the memory implementation as well. 3800 megahertz CL14 from G.Skill, not a problem on this motherboard, and on Ryzen, yeah, it'll give you that much more, that much higher of a frame rate, especially if you're running at 1080p, especially with games like older games like CS:GO and GTA 5 and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Let's take a look at the rear I/O. At the rear I/O, we've got our Intel Wi-Fi 6 connection. This is a 2x2, it's got Bluetooth as well. This is our antenna connection, and in the box bundled are proper awesome antennas, not those rubber duck antennas. Good job, AsRock. We've got our clear CMOS button and our BIOS flashback button, which are a little bit recessed on this generation. It's nice to see. Of course, the IO shield is built in. I'll mention that always because it doesn't cost much, and it's really nice to not have to deal with the IO shield. I don't think you're going to accidentally press BIOS flashback or the reset button. BIOS flashback is great because you can add support for CPUs that aren't out yet in the future without having to boot your system to with an older CPU in order to update the BIOS, because normally you can't update the BIOS unless you have a working system. This will let you update the BIOS even if you have a non-working system, because it's just there's a computer within a computer to handle updating the BIOS from a USB flash drive, and that button is like, hey, read from a flash drive and update that. I'm not gonna get into the procedure for that, but yeah, that's a thing. It does work. Just be aware of it. Then we've got 8 USB ports. It's a mix of USB 3, USB 2, and USB 3.2 Gen 2 10 gigabit. So we got one Type A and one Type C. It's a pretty good mix. And of course our Realtek ALC 1220 based audio solution with, Nahimic audio. So AsRock's put a little bit more work into the audio implementation on this motherboard, and it shows in the signal to noise ratio testing and all that kind of thing. Good job, AsRock. In terms of other headers on the motherboard, we do have a hardware power and reset button, which is nice. Diagnostic LED readout. 7 Pwm Fan Headers. This is great. AsRock's got the fantastic tuning in the BIOS. I always love a good pun. So that's always worked really well. One thing that I didn't see in the BIOS is tuning options for the RGB. You still have your 5050 and your digital RGB headers. So, everything is here that you would expect for RGB tuning, but no BIOS control, which seems odd. There was BIOS support for bifurcation control. That's always a question that comes up on the level 1 forum. And so I'm gonna try to get in the habit of always taking screenshots or video from the BIOS. And so here is that video, and you can see that, yeah, you can bifurcate the primary X16 slot into by 8x8 or by 4x4x4x4. So if you wanna do that with some really high-end storage, you can. Of course, keep in mind this platform only has 20 PCI Express 4 lanes total, and everything else is PCI Express 3.0, so you're going to be relegating your graphics to a PCI Express by 4 connection if you do run some sort of crazy 4x4 NVMe RAID solution. So there you have it. There's the AsRock B550 Taichi. It's a really high-end B550 motherboard. I mean, I would sort of expect that given the cost, but confirmed. So nice job, AsRock. I'm Wendell, this is Level 1, I'm signing out, and I'll see you later. Be sure to check that forum thread.